Many of the waterfalls in Iceland are very easy to access, but Alderfoss requires a little bit more effort, but it's totally worth it.
So we're still in northern Iceland. We're at Alderfoss. It's a very, very impressive waterfall. You hike down, and when you get to the bottom, it reveals this beautiful chasm and this big pool of water with the waterfall shooting water, cascading towards you. We got here and the sun started to come up on the right, and it threw these beautiful colors, which are still back there now. The colors have been going nuts for the last hour and a half. It's amazing this morning. The first thing I did when I came down here is I scouted different vantage points. I kind of followed this rocky ridgeline around and tried to figure out the best composition possible. Once I established that this composition was my favorite, I set the camera up and I haven't actually moved it for about 2 hours. The sky has just been transforming so much that I wanted to capture it at its very best moment. So if we take a look at the images at the beginning of the day, the first thing in the morning when I first set up, the sky was just starting to light up a little bit, but throughout time you can see how it progressively gets better and better and better. Talking a little bit about the composition first, what really caught my attention was the pool of water below. I love how it fills the frame from left to right and leads into the shape of the waterfall and then into the incredible sky. So I had a feeling that if I used a neutral density filter and added a long exposure effect, that since that water is cascading towards me, that it's going to create streaky lines and tendrils of detail. So there was a point where the sun started to come up and we had incredible colors, and it kind of peaked. And once it peaked, it started to decline. So usually you'll notice that the colors will get really vivid. You'll start to see really nice reds, oranges, and yellows. And then as soon as it starts to fade off, you'll actually visually notice that those colors become less saturated. This time of year, since it's wintertime, the sun moves so slow that it's a gradual transition. So it hits its peak, sits there for a little while, and then it starts to gradually decline. A big piece of advice that I like to give to all photographers is to arrive at your location as early as possible. And this is for a couple reasons. One reason is it gives you enough time to scout out the location thoroughly and make sure you settle on your favorite composition. Secondly, it gives you time to audition all of the light as it's changing. So I had no idea that the light was going to last as long as it did, but I was set up here and ready to capture it just in case it was a brief moment in time. So right now, if I wanted to do one exposure and I just hit the camera trigger, it would expose for the foreground and my sky would be blown out. I could change the settings in camera to expose for the sky, but then my foreground is going to be really, really dark. So instead, I'm going to use a feature in camera called auto exposure bracketing that's going to allow me to shoot a regular exposure and then underexposures and overexposures. Exposure bracketing is a technique that I use in more than 90% of my images because it allows me to capture any environment that has a great range of light. So let's take a look at the camera and let's see exactly how auto exposure bracketing works. So I'm going to press the bracket button, and on my Nikon D810 it's right on the side next to the flash button. When I press that, it's going to ask me what I want to do, and I'm going to thumb dial to the right, and it's going to go from 3 to 5. So basically, if I set it to 3, it'll do 1 under and 1 over. This camera has the option to go all the way to 9, which means 4 under and 4 over. For this scene, we're just going to use 5, which is 2 under and 2 over. Now the number in the upper right means stops. So right now at 5 exposures, I have 2 stops under and 2 stops over. Now you can change this to actually be 2 stops or even 3 stops. You can also bring it down so it'll do 1/3 of a stop. Now I like, for most of my scenes, just to use 1 full stop. So for this shot, we're going to use 5 exposure brackets. That's 2 under and 2 over, and these are at 1 stop. Now, of course, I can also do this manually by toggling the settings in between shots, but auto exposure bracketing does this automatically for you. One of the reasons I love using auto exposure bracketing as opposed to doing everything manually is it prevents me from having to touch the camera too much and possibly moving the composition. So let's take a look at the camera now. The first thing I'm going to do is show you a single exposure, and then I'm going to show you 5 bracketed exposures. So now my camera is set to the basic settings that I usually use, f8, ISO 64. So I'm going to go ahead and take a single exposure. So as you can see, I have a really nice composition. The foreground is pretty much correctly exposed. The water is a little bit blown out, and when I say blown out, I just mean we're losing a little bit of those highlights. It's getting lost in white. And clearly you can see that the sky is way too bright. I'm gonna need to adjust this exposure in order to compensate for that. So I've decided to change my camera settings just a little bit. By default, when you take exposure brackets, it'll automatically take the neutral median exposure first, and then an under and an over. So when you review these files, when you click on your image preview, it'll show you the median exposure and then -1 and +1 and so on and so on. I don't really like that. I changed the order so that it'll take and show me -1, 0, and +1. So in this case, it's gonna show me -2, -1, 0, +1, and +2, so that I can see them in order. And this is something that you can change easily in the camera menu. If you want to change the order of your exposure brackets, you can go into your menu, go down to the custom settings menu, down to bracketing and flash, and then down to bracketing order. In this section, you can say under, MTR, and over. The default is MTR under over. Now this is great because when we look at our Lightroom catalog, we're going to have all these files to choose from, and this gives us the ability to just look at everything from dark to light without any confusion at all. All right, so let's review. And again, I'm reviewing now the exposure that's -2, and you can see that that sky looks great. You can see that really nice hot spot where the sun is, and if I check my histogram, you can see that nothing's clipped on the right. It actually looks visually perfect. So if I thumb through my files here, I'm gonna go to the -1, and you can see that the foreground now is getting a little bit better exposed, and the background's getting washed out in the sky. This was the original neutral exposure, and then you can see the +1 and the +2. So in this case, I probably won't use my +1 and +2 exposures, but it was easy for me to toggle 5 exposures to be able to capture -2, -1, and 0 together. So in this case, I used 5 exposure brackets because I knew that I'd need a -2 to capture the sky. Sometimes you're going to encounter situations that are so bright that you might need 9 exposures, which means that you have 4 underexposed and 4 overexposed. This is really going to depend on the amount of light in the scene. And a good rule of thumb is start with 3 or 5, and if that's not enough, just go ahead and turn it to 7 and 9. Usually you don't have to start at 7 and 9 right off the bat. So now I have all the exposures I need to be able to put it all back together in post-processing. Now what I'm going to do next is take a little bit of artistic license on this image, and I'm going to use a 4-stop neutral density filter to smooth the water. I want to try to get a 15 or a 30-second exposure to have those nice tendrils of smooth water, and I'm going to use this exposure as an additional element to blend in post-processing. So now my shot is composed, everything's locked down and ready to go. The first thing that I'm going to do, since I know that I'm going to combine exposure brackets and also an additional exposure for the soft water effect, I'm going to lock my white balance. So more than 90% of the time I shoot an auto white balance because it's pretty good at discerning the scene. But since I'm going to be combining multiple elements together, I want additional control over the consistency of my color temperature. Now I know I can change that a little bit in post, but I want it to be as close as possible when I combine these images. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set my camera, turn it from auto white balance to my custom white balance, and I'm going to set my own Kelvin temperature of 9,000 so I have a nice warm scene throughout. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to press the white balance button, and you can see that it's in auto mode right now, and I'm going to use the thumb dial to get over to K mode. Now, as that number starts to decrease and get below around 4,000, you can see that my image becomes very blue and cold. But as I start to increase that number and I get up to the 7,000 to 9,000 range, you can see that it becomes very warm. So for this shot, I've settled on 9,090 Kelvin. So there are really 2 elements that are moving in our scene right now. The rocks are obviously 100% static. If they weren't static, we'd be running away in terror. Basically, the water's moving towards us and the sky's moving away from us to the left. Using a long exposure to capture the soft water would also streak the sky. I don't want that to happen because the detail in the sky is really beautiful. There's all these little edges to these clouds and all this tiny little detail and color that I want to preserve. So my auto exposure brackets are relatively fast exposures. They will not disturb the clarity of the sky. That way, when I capture just the water soft in Photoshop, I can blend that in separately and still retain all of that detail in the sky. So now we have all of our settings locked in. We've captured our 5 exposure brackets. We have everything we need for the scene. Now let's use that 4-stop neutral density filter to capture the soft water. Now usually I would put this filter holder on the lens first, and then I'd walk around to the front of the lens and I'd slide the filter into the holder. But as you can see, I'm right up against the edge, so there's no way I can safely go around my camera. So what I'm gonna do instead, I have the adapter ring screwed onto my lens already. I'm gonna attach the filter and make sure that it's secure in the holder. And then what I'm gonna do is just reach around to the front of my lens and add this very, very carefully. So this is a really, really easy way to make sure that you do not disturb your camera. And in this case, it's much safer because if you're not careful and you do things the hard way, sometimes you can break things as well. So this is actually the correct way to do it. I tried to do it the way I usually do it, but since I could not see the front of the camera, it was a little bit harder to put the filter in, and we had our first casualty of production. These filters, these are glass filters, they're not cheap. So the last thing you want to do is bust one of these, especially this is our 4th day of production. So thankfully, I always carry a backup of the filters that I use the most. So since I use a 4-stop all the time, I make sure that I travel with 2. So the filter is now in place, everything's ready to go. First thing I'm gonna do is disable exposure bracketing. You do that just by holding the button down and thumbing the wheel a little bit until it's disabled completely. After that, I'm gonna switch to manual mode so I can program in my own 15-second exposure, and I'm also gonna do a 30, and we're gonna compare and see if 15 or 30 looks better. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set my exposure time to 15 seconds, and then I'm gonna find some settings that look good on the light meter on the top of the camera. So I'm gonna set it to f11 and leave the ISO at 64. It says that it's gonna overexpose it just a hair, but I think that's gonna work really well to pop that water out in the foreground. So let's give it a try at 15 seconds. Okay, so there's our 15-second exposure. You can see that it looks really, really cool. The sky's still blown out, but that doesn't really matter. We're only concerned about the water in the foreground. And in this case, since the water's rushing towards us rapidly, it's creating these nice leading lines and these tendrils of water. I think it looks really, really awesome. So our 15-second exposure looks really good. I'm gonna change it now to 30 seconds. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that first here, change 15 to 30. Now that I'm doing 30 seconds, I'm gonna have to compensate by raising the f-stop an entire stop. So from 11, 1 stop in the f-stop range becomes 16. Okay, so now we've shot a 15-second exposure and a 30-second exposure. Let's just compare them side by side here. So you can see my 15, I still retain a little bit of the detail in that water, so it's a little bit turbulent. And at 30, it starts to soften out a little bit more. I think in this case, I may favor the 15 just because I retain a little bit more detail. But in post-processing, this is a wonderful option because now we can audition whether that 15-second exposure looks good or that 30-second exposure looks good, and we can just use the one that we like the most to create what we want for this image. One other thing to point out about these shots, and this 30-second exposure in particular, is that even though the sky is a little bit blown out, we can also see that we have a motion in those clouds. So that was what I wanted to avoid by shooting everything with the exposure brackets with a faster shutter speed so that I could retain that detail. As you can see here with that 30 seconds, I start to lose that little detail because it all just becomes soft. Now, since I'm doing all this different exposure work, and in this case some longer exposures, I'm using a very, very stable tripod. It's leveled perfectly. Everything is locked down because I want to make sure that nothing moves in between my exposure brackets or during my long exposures. Now, I'm using this timer that we've looked at before, which allows me to lock shutters and not disturb the camera. But if I didn't have one of those, I could easily go into my camera's functions and use a self-timer mode. I can set that self-timer to be 2 seconds, so when I press the shutter release button, it'll count down 2 seconds and then do my exposure brackets back to back, or engage my long exposure. Now, since it has a 2-second delay, it means that once I press it and let go, I'm no longer disturbing the camera when those exposures begin. So if I want to use the self-timer to capture my exposure brackets, first thing I'll do is go into the menu, Custom Settings menu, Timers AE Lock. Next thing I'll select is self-timer. First thing I'll select in self-timer is the delay. Since I don't really need much time between the shot, I'm not setting up a group shot, I'm going to pick the lowest setting of 2 seconds. Next thing I'm going to pick is the number of shots. This number doesn't matter. If it's set to 1 and you have exposure bracketing enabled, the camera will still capture all of those exposure brackets. That doesn't matter if it's 3, 5, 7, or 9. Last thing I'm going to set is the interval between shots. Again, I'm going to pick the lowest setting, in this case, ½ a second. So in this lesson, we've learned how to use exposure bracketing, and we're also going to learn in Photoshop how to combine those exposure brackets with another long exposure. Now in this tutorial, in this section, I use the long exposure to blur specifically the water. Now I could have easily used that to blur the sky as well, but as an artistic choice, I decided to keep the sky completely intact and only have blurry water. This is going to be completely up to you. You can use long exposures in any type of scene. It doesn't necessarily need to be a waterfall. It can be a cityscape. It can be something where people move through the scene. Basically, when your exposure stays open for a while, when it's longer, anything that moves is going to leave a streak in your scene, whether that's water, whether that's the sky, or whether that's people and objects. So now let's go into Photoshop and put all of this together. This one's going to be really fun. So here we are, welcome back to the post-processing portion. This is for EL-PTWLPAP-L5. This is lesson 5. You guys remember this was that epic waterfall. We all loved it. I think Lee got the best drone footage of the entire trip here. It was just an incredible waterfall to be around. So this lesson, I have to admit, we're gonna ramp up in difficulty just a little bit. This is where we're gonna start introducing not just working with raw files, but also blending multiple exposures together. After we blend multiple exposures together, we're gonna take it the next step even further and then blend in the soft water on top of that. Once all that's put together and blended, the next thing we're gonna do is take it to its final state, add all that color and contrast that we've already been working towards. So let's begin. Here we are inside of Lightroom, and you can see I've included the files that I want you guys to work on and we're going to work on together. While I was shooting, I was right up on the edge and I shot 5 exposure brackets. You can see them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I also shot 2 more exposure brackets with a 4-stop neutral density filter, and I did one 15-second exposure and one 30-second exposure. So you can see that beautiful tendril water wash. In the normal exposure, you can see that I have the choppy, normal, turbulent water, which doesn't look bad, but it doesn't look as unique as these really soft tendrils and little pieces of waterfall. So you might remember when we worked on the Godafoss waterfall, we're going to do a little bit more to amplify this, but the first thing we need to do is put it all back together. So thinking all the way back to the first lesson we had together, remember I told you guys you can always get a lot out of the shadows in a raw file, but you can't get as much out of the highlights. Same thing applies here. We're going to have to work a little bit harder because even the neutral exposure, it's exposed fairly well, but look at all the blacks here, look at all the highlights here. If I actually hit J on my keyboard, you're going to see these little clipping areas show up. So red means that it's clipped in the highlights, black means that it's clipped in the shadows. And what does clipped mean? Clipped means that it's actually missing from the left or the right of this histogram. If I go down to the -2, you're going to see much more black that's lost. And if I go up to the +2, you're going to see a whole sky covered in loss here. So we know from experience that we cannot get this value back from this file. But based on my experience, I also know that I probably can't get all that detail back in the sky here. And that's because most of it, it's not that it's gone, it's just there's so much subtlety, and this little strip of highlight above the mountain is really intense, so intense that it really starts to look good at a -2 exposure. So not only is it all perfectly exposed for, but see all the little details, there's all these little tones, all these little bits of oranges. This is really what I want to see in the sky. I've captured all this detail, so now we have to put it back together. So rather than adjusting a single raw, what we're going to do is combine 2 raws together. And I'm going to use a +1 so that I can balance the foreground here, and then I'm going to use a -1
just for the highlights. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to walk you through this. And again, exposure blending doesn't have to be complicated. In the past, years and years ago, you might be doing this in HDR software, but now these days it's really easy to do all the blending manually. My workflow over the last few years has been a 100% manual blending workflow. And remember, for this whole series, I'm teaching you guys from day one how I get the look I get in my imagery and how I get the portfolio shots that I do. So this is the basics of how I approach exposure blending. Again, we're going to be doing it the simplest and most powerful way possible, and I'll be walking you guys through the steps the whole time. So let's go ahead and go to the +1 exposure. The first thing that I'm going to do is work to balance my shadows. So this one's not going to be too much about the sky. We know it's already gone. I'm going to focus right on this foreground and getting this to look exactly how I want it. From now on, you guys remember that everything's already going to be zeroed out here, distortion's removed, chromatic aberration, and also that really pesky sharpening that's built into Lightroom. So don't worry about that anymore once you open these Lightroom files. So the first thing I'm going to do, everything looks exposed correctly. I'm just going to pull the shadows up maybe just a little bit more, just to get some of that detail back. I really want the details here because I know I'm going to want to amplify all that in post later. I may pull the highlights down just a little bit just to compensate, just to pull some of that sky back so that I have a better blending point to work with. But really I don't want to do too much here. I want to keep it pretty much true to itself and maybe just pull the blacks. Because remember, if I hit J and I start moving the blacks, we can actually see what's clipped. So I want to make sure that I'm not clipping any of those black values, just pulling it right out of the red zone, or in this case, the blue zone. All right, so that's going to be the shadow. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and bring this layer into Photoshop. So I'm going to say File, Export with Previous, and now we have our base layer. Before I go any further, what I want to do so we can build this up in layers together, and it's something that I like to do just so I can keep track of how far I push something, I'm going to reset the tone and I'm going to export it one more time. Export with Previous. This time I'm going to say Use Unique Names. This is going to be repetitive. I'm going to get this into the other document by Command A for Select All, Command C for Copy, and then Close with Command W. I'm going to paste this ahead. And I'm just going to shuffle the order of these so that I can have the original raw. And I'll go ahead and name it too so we can start staying organized. Original, raw, and then we'll call this raw shadows. We'll go back into Lightroom. So now that I have my foreground taken care of, I have basically my layers here for the balanced highlights in the foreground, the waterfall, balanced shadows. I can go ahead and start focusing on the highlights. So remember, I want to really retain this and I want to keep all this detail, and that detail's pretty much there. Now at this point, I could just send this into Photoshop and I could try to blend the sky in over the background that I've already created of the shadows, but that makes it a little bit more difficult because notice how much different the tones are here than they are here. So if you do more raw adjustment, if you bring those shadows back to something that's a little bit more close to what you're blending with, it's going to make the blending process much less crucial and easy to do with simple paint, simple masking, and simple gradients. So essentially, matching these and matching the tones as close as possible simplifies your life to the next degree, which is really great. We always want to simplify things and make it as seamless as possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave these highlights alone. And remember, just like we did before, I'm going to do the exposure a little bit. I can bring that exposure up. I can bring the shadows up. And I can pull the highlights back down and have all that. And even pull the whites down a little bit, just so I have the sky that I want, and I'm still able to get some of the foreground that I want. This is going to make it easier to blend in Photoshop, and I'll pull the shadows up. Now you can see the difference of this one recovered as opposed to this one that I have. The one that I have that I've been using, the +1, looks much more natural. You can see that the one that I've recovered here from -1 is a little bit gray, and I'm just double checking that everything is about the same, and I maybe even want to pull my whites up just a little bit more. I don't want to retain, don't want really any of this to turn gray. So now I have my highlights, I have the sky layer that I want. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say Export with Previous. Next step is to get this into my other document, so I'm going to basically select all, copy, close, and then I'm going to paste here. So now I have 3 layers, and I'm going to go ahead and say raw highlights. Perfect. So here we go. Original raw, balanced shadows, and balanced highlights. Now, this is where it gets really fun. We need to use masking to mask in the portion of the highlights. I basically only want the highlights to be associated with the sky, and I want the rest of it to be contained inside of the raw shadows. So what I'm going to do is create another mask, and I'm going to create the new mask. And the first thing that I like to do, now this horizon is pretty much level. There's no jagged mountains, there's nothing too crazy about it, there's nothing I really have to avoid. So I can probably solve most of this with just a simple gradient ramp. So I'm going to select the gradient tool from white to black, and I'm going to go ahead and blend it just about here to here into itself. So now I have the highlight sitting right on top. And you can see that I've blended that sky now into the underlying layer. And it's looking pretty good. Now I can also hit the backslash key again, and I can show the masking. Now here's where I can do a little bit of cleanup. All of the sky is present, so all of my sky layer is contained inside of the sky layer. It looks really good. But now I might want to paint out some of the negative aspects of this. Like here where the mountain's a little bit high, I want you guys to pay attention to this layer. And you can see that this layer, the whites aren't as crisp. Notice that's a little bit gray. So I'm going to go back to my quick mask mode. I'm going to hit B for brush. And we've been doing this with dodging and burning. We've been doing this with the masking. But essentially, I'm just going to pick a flow of around 10 or 20%. Painting black will allow me to just paint it out. Now the nice thing is I used a gradient, so it's a soft gradation. Nobody's going to notice. Now the other thing that's really powerful about this is if I would have left the raw file unedited for the highlights and I would have done the same thing, we would have noticed that that mountain was black. And we didn't want that mountain to be black. We wanted it to be as close to the same shades as possible. So even though we're not using much of it, anywhere it overlaps itself, it's blending into itself, so we're not going to have any seams at all. Now obviously there are other ways to do this, but with a brush and with a stylus, it's really intuitive to be able to just go in and paint. There's nothing difficult about it. We could have picked the lasso tool or one of the selection tools, and we could have clicked all the way around this and created a perfect selection. But since it's nice, pretty much level, even horizon, we don't have to work that hard to get powerful results. Let me back this up, and now we've gone from this here to this. So now we've properly exposed the sky. Now I just want to show you guys something for the sake of argument. Let's say, well, you know, I think I could have done a better job here. I think I'm still missing some of the details in the sky, and I want to give it another pass just to try to get it back. If at any time you want to do that, what you can do is go back into Lightroom, and all you have to do is tweak this. So let's say that I took the highlights down even more. You know, something ridiculous like that. And actually, to be honest, I'm getting a lot of that back. If I took the exposure now to 0.9 and made changes. When we're toggling things back and forth or showing a side-by-side view in Lightroom, sometimes it's a little bit harder to see. So I'm just going to do another version of this, and I'm going to say export, export with previous. And in this case, I'm just going to overwrite. With the new version, I just have to get it into the other document. Same hotkeys as before, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it. Now you can see that this sky looks a little bit different. So what I'm actually going to do now, I've already created this mask, I'm just going to drag it to the new layer, and I'm going to delete the old one. And now I get the new sky, which actually has even more detail in it. So at this point we have a basic blend. Congratulations, you guys have just done your first exposure blend. Shot 5 exposure brackets, and now we've blended 2 of them together, and we didn't have to rely on any HDR software to do it for us. So congratulations, this is the first step into a blending workflow. Let's take it one step further. Let's say that we want to use the water. So remember when I was on location, I'd shoot my 5 exposure brackets at f8 or f11. I think this one was f8 if I'm not mistaken. Then I shot my long exposures. I did a 15 and a 30. So now let's do the same process. Let's bring just the water in. Now check this out too. I'm going to teach you guys another technique. Let's zoom in on this image right here. That is Patrick Hall. I think at this point Patrick Hall is doing a selfie or a behind the scenes video talking about how epic the waterfall is and how he's on the lower level. And it also, you can see how big this waterfall is. He had to walk all the way down there in his crampons. So we're going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, or we're going to kill 1 bird and 1 Patrick with 1 stone. And we're going to go ahead and get back into Lightroom first and see how we can make that happen. So the first thing that we have to do is figure out which one we want to use. Now there's options here. Remember that a 15-second one, I'm going to retain a lot of this little detail in the water, but as soon as I get into a 30, 30 is going to soften it even more, and I'm going to create these really nice lines. And we know a 60, it would have been even more soft. So for my preference, I like the 60-second exposure. We're not concerned about the sky here. We're just mostly concerned about the mountain and balancing that, and also the water. One other thing that I need to point out at this point is that even though I locked the white balance, you can see that the original one we're working at is a touch warmer than this one. In this case, it cooled down just a little bit. So what I'm going to do first is go ahead and balance this. We'll bring the shadows up a little bit, just as before. That looks pretty good. The highlights, I'm going to hit the J key. Those are all blown out. This looks pretty good. Blacks look pretty good. I'll just go ahead and bring them up just a little bit more in the shadows just in case, probably just a hair on the exposure. And that looks pretty good. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to warm up the temperature. This one's 10,000. This one's also 10,000 because I went ahead and locked it at 10,000 so that it would be consistent. But even with a locked white balance in your camera, sometimes these filters, they don't really have a color cast. It's just when you start squeezing light through a dark shade filter, sometimes it cools off a little bit. And in this case, it's just slightly cooler. So it's not even really a color cast, and we can compensate by just changing the white balance just a little bit. So maybe bring it up to 12, 12.2 or 12.5 and just toggling a little bit before and after. And that looks much better. So let's go ahead and get this one into Photoshop now by saying right-click, export, export with previous. Once again, we need to bring this into the other document, select all, copy, close, and paste. Now something interesting happened here, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see it. Remember when I was setting up the filter holder and I said I couldn't walk around to the front because there was no front to walk around to, it was just a sheer drop? That means I had to be really careful putting the filter holder on the front of the camera and on the front of the lens, and I was really careful to not disturb the camera at all, but unfortunately I did disturb it just a little bit. So this shifts a little bit, and actually if let's take a look at these rocks right here, and I turn this on and off, you can see that it shifts a little bit. Now it's not just a shift, it's actually a zoom. I managed to push back the lens just a little bit so it actually zooms out. So I can't align these things in Photoshop because it actually zooms in a hair. But thankfully enough, there's no real crucial lines here. So anywhere this blends in, I'm just going to do it on the water, nobody will even really notice. So here's what we're going to do. Remember when I showed you guys you can create a mask by clicking the mask button, that creates a white mask, or if you hold Option, that creates a black mask. So I'm going to create a black mask here so it's completely invisible, and I'm going to pick B for brush tool, and this time I'm going to pick a medium-sized brush with a flow of 0 or 100%. When I hit 0, it turns 100. I'm just going to start painting in this soft water. So being very conscious around the edges here. Maybe even up top a little bit up here. I might paint some of that in just so I get the reflections and the nice soft water. Change the brush size a little bit here, and then paint all of this out. Now remember, I'm overlapping in water. If there's a little shift, honestly, you'd never notice because it's water. I'm just going to follow the edge here. I'm going to follow the edge, follow the edge. I'm going to wait here, and I'm going to save the best part for last, which is Patrick removal. So from here, we're going to say, bye-bye, Patrick. We just saved ourselves the trouble of having to clone him out. So it's very important that we get the entire waterfall. You can do this with a selection tool if you want, but I like the paintbrush. I have a stylus. It feels artistic. It's gestural, intuitive, and just overall cool in my opinion. So here we go. We have this, and I can show a quick mask again with the backslash key, and I can see if there's anything, and you can see, even if I made an effort here, I still missed some little spots. So I want to make sure that I didn't miss any spots whatsoever. So I have this whole thing, everything, the water and the soft water. So that looks pretty good. So far so good. We've actually gone from this here, which is our original exposure, and now we've created something a little bit more artistic, a little bit more beautiful by combining different exposures together. So again, this one's pretty simple. It's 2 exposures. We kind of made them look a little bit more uniform, match the highlights and shadows the best as possible, blended it with a gradient, and we removed Patrick, and at the same time got these really nice soft water effects. So at this point, I like to keep everything non-linear, which means that I can go back at any point and make changes. Just in case I start applying more effects, I like to make sure everything's built on layers. So the next thing that I'm going to do though, before I move on and start doing things, remember all of this here, all of these things that I shot here were shot at a very good f-stop, so I'm really hiding a lot of the problems with the lenses. I'm hiding all the dust on the sensor, all the water spots, any of those things that are happening here. But since this was shot at a higher f-stop, if I zoom into the water, you can see that I still get some of these spots. So I'm going to have to remove them, and I'm going to try to use the same thing, the spot healing brush again, just to get rid of some of these real quick. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I don't think there's too many bad ones. The nice thing about water and about skies, again, is nobody really notices unless it's something that just looks odd. So when there's a little water spot or a dust spot, that looks odd. But all of these little disturbances, these little tendrils, really they're kind of odd in themselves, but they don't look out of place. So the rule with object removal or spot removal or even object replacement is if people didn't know it was replaced, they're not going to notice any errors really on it. It's kind of a nice thing. So I'm going to do the same thing here with the sky layer. I'm just going to do a few of these real quick. And I'm not going to do the trick where we use the contrast layer because this one honestly wasn't so bad. And the other great thing about the Nikon D810 and a lot of the new cameras is they allow you to shoot in low ISO. So it's nice when your camera does something like 100 ISO or 50 ISO, or in this case, even though it's an in-camera function for the ISO, the D810 actually has an ISO of 31. Some general rules: the lower your ISO, the least amount of noise you're going to have, and the more you can push your image. And they also say, I'm not sure if this is true with the D810, but if you shoot at their native ISO 64, which is their lowest setting, you actually get a little bit more dynamic range. I don't know if that's true with the dynamic range, but I do know that you can push them a little bit further without getting extra noise in your image. So let's call that a day. Let's call that a blend. And in fact, since I call that a blend, I'm going to take all of these layers, drag them to the Make New folder, and that's just going to put them all in a folder, just like we were organizing anything else, and I'm going to name it Blend. I'm going to go ahead and hit Save as well, just in case. So we have Blend. From Blend, there's another hotkey I want to show you guys. I want to create a Nik software layer, so I just want to take this into Nik software. But if I go up to Filter, you can see that Nik software is grayed out. I actually can't access it. So what I'm going to do is use this crazy hotkey, which is actually Shift, Option, Command, E. And that hotkey, believe it or not, is make a new layer out of everything. So basically everything in my layers here, it's going to basically make a new one out of that. The cool thing is it's duplicate of everything that's in Blend, and now I can go up to Filter and do Nik Collection. I'm going to go to Color Effects Pro. Now, this is actually interesting. What I want to point out here while we're loading Color Effects Pro is that before I was dealing with really soft light. Now, while there is soft light in the foreground here, I also have really intense light in the background. So even at the blend state now, based on the blend as opposed to or comparing to the original RAW, I like this image already. I think it looks really nice. So I'm not going to have to push things as far to get exactly what I want. Inside of Color Effects Pro, I'm going to go right to Pro Contrast, my go-to adding dynamic contrast as usual. So you can see I'm just going to add a little bit of dynamic contrast. It does wonders for the shadows and the highlights, brings back some of these details. It's also why I held back a little bit in Adobe Camera Raw in Lightroom, just because I knew that this was going to take it a little bit further, which is pretty nice. Correcting the contrast is just going to, you'll notice here down to the right, when I do that, it's going to slide this to the right and just fix those highlights that I may have over-clamped or just overcompensated for when I did the adjustment. I'm just going to try correct color range, and you can see that it doesn't do a whole lot to this image. It's not exactly what I want. So with dynamic contrast all set the way that I want, I'm going to add another filter. And believe it or not, this time I'm going to add another Pro Contrast, and I want to focus specifically on these areas. Now these areas here, these are basalt columns. These are frozen basalt columns. Very beautiful. A lot of the rock in Iceland is basalt. So it's very, very famous and very extraordinary, actually. And it's really only native to certain parts of the world. And Iceland has a lot of basalt that's become the basis for a lot of their modern architecture. The big church in Reykjavik, for example, is actually built and modeled after one of the very famous basalt cliffs. So I know if you look at it, it looks like a rocket ship, but it's actually supposed to be a basalt waterfall. So these are really cool, and I want to chisel out that detail. and I want to add some more dynamic contrast to it. So you can see that if I do that, I'm actually pulling these values up, but I'm also getting more to the image. I don't want it on the image, I just want it in some of these basalt areas here. So I'm basically just going to add a little bit more of the contrast where I want it, and I'm going to leave it off on the rest of the image. So it's just going to add a little bit more of that pro contrast on this side. I don't want it in the sky, so I'm just going to remove it. This is the same thing that we've done with the U points before, and I'm going to say OK for this effect. Last thing that I'm going to do, you guys remember, the polarization is just going to give me a little bit more kick to the colors in the sky. Right now they're warm tones. I want them to be a little bit more intense, and you can see that as I go to the right, that heats up a little bit. One last thing that I can do in color effects before we start to do this selectively is that I can add another one. I can add brilliance and warmth. If I add warmth totally, it's going to warm up the whole scene, which looks pretty good. I like that, but let's take it a step further. Let's warm up the entire scene. Let's add one more. Let's add one more brilliance and warmth. Now, these things can be stacked infinitely. The only thing that happens is your process time takes a little bit longer. So with brilliance and warmth now set, warmth up very high, I'm just going to apply this to certain parts in the sky where I want to continue some of those warm tones. Even down here, you can see there's extra warm tones here. And that's going to be really subtle, but it's just going to be extra brilliance and warmth in the sky. Let's go ahead and apply that effect now before we move forward. Now that's starting to look pretty good. Everything's warm, everything has a lot of good contrast, starting to look a little bit more vibrant, but I've done something to damage the image. Pay attention specifically to this region right here, and I'm just going to make a selection around it. If I toggle the before and after, you can see that by making it a little bit too intense, I've gone a little bit too far, and if I go up here to my histogram, you can see that I actually have a spike on the right side. I can show specifically the colors or the luminosity here, in this case the colors, and you can see, yep, there's a red spike. That means I've lost that information. So what I want to do is actually blend this into the original result. So I have the before and the after, and what I'm going to do is just take the opacity down just a little bit until I get that spike to go away. If I get kind of frustrated because I really like everything that I did in the foreground, another thing that I can do is just put a quick mask on this, and I can change it to be a gradient. So I can keep everything in the foreground and I can get rid of everything in the sky. So if I do that, I can basically create a soft gradation here and then just keep everything in the foreground. But then I lose all of that effort that I put into the warmth of the sky. So here's where things get a little bit more complicated. I've created a mask. The nice thing about a mask is it's better than erasing or deleting a portion of an image, because if you delete a portion of an image, if you use the eraser tool or anything like that, it's gone forever until you undo it. You do a Command Z and undo it. So with a mask, I can delete the mask, change it to an infinite state basically, and it stays nonlinear, and it's always available for adjustment. Well, on that train of thought, if I go into the masks, I can also change the feather and the density. So right now the density of the mask is actually 100%. If I turn it to 0, it basically takes that effect away. So I really only want to remove about 20% to 30% of what I did to the sky on that density, just until this spike changes. So you see there at 100%, it's gone completely. At 0%, I have that spike. But right around 20 or 30%, that spike starts to disappear. I'll just make it 30%. So now I have a soft mask here. I didn't destroy any of the sky, but I maintained 100% here of the effect in the foreground and only about 70% here. So that's really nice. Since I've done that, I'm going to do a Command E, and I'm going to blend these things together just to make it into one layer. And this is going to be the first Color Effects Pro result. So I'm just going to name it CEP for Color Effects Pro. If you guys have been opening the PSDs, you know that that's my naming for Color Effects Pro. Next step, let's go ahead and sharpen it up a little bit because it'll stay on top. Filter, again, high pass. These are just the things that I do to all of my images, especially landscapes, just to chisel out those details. Set it to overlay. Black out the mask, Alt, click the new mask tool, select the brush, say 100% flow, and I'm going to start painting in. I'm going to go to the quick mask mode, and I'm actually just going to keep going here. I'm going to make sure that I'm painting in the mask, just in the rocks. Remember, I don't want to sharpen the water. I don't want to sharpen the sky. I want to take very careful care of the sky and not add any extra noise. So here I can just change that using my stylus, and I can just paint in these areas. Again, this is just sharpness. If I miss a few spots, it's okay. It's non-linear, sits on top, and everything's fine. If I make a mistake here, I can just hit X, go to black, and I can just paint it right out. So now I have sharpness throughout the whole image. And if I take a look at this, we have the sharpened result. And this is really nice. If I zoom right into these little details here, see all the rocks? If I turn this off, you can see that they kind of disappear. But with that, I get all these nice little cellular basalt details. And that looks really good. At this point, here's where it turns into an artistic process. It was kind of a workflow before. We had to blend everything, get that back to a par or a blend, and now we're starting to enhance those details. Here's where it becomes a little bit more artistic. The next thing I'm going to do is create a dodge and burn layer, and just like I did with the last waterfall, I'm going to follow these nice cellular patterns of the basalt columns and where the light's actually hitting it. In this case, we have a very, very readable sun direction. The sun's coming from the right, so it should be illuminating the left side of the screen, and you can see that here if I circle the basalt on the left as opposed to the basalt on the right. But there's all this little rich detail to pull out in the foreground and the background. So let's go ahead and create our first dodge and burn layer here. And again, if I hold Option key and click on the new layer button, change it to overlay, then I get the option for 50% gray. And I can just call this dodge and burn. I like to name all my files and all my layers just so later on if I look at it I know what I was thinking. So here we go. Let's go ahead and start creatively painting some of this in, and I just want to show you guys all I do with dodging and burning. I'm not really creating light. What I'm doing is just enhancing what's already there. Now that's a very important distinction because a lot of people think when you're light painting, if you think of light painting at night, you think light painting, and light painting like we're going to do in the second video when we get into night photography and astrophotography, we are literally painting light onto objects that didn't exist there before. So dodging and burning isn't exactly light painting. What it is just light enhancement. So if we already have natural highlights and shadows, this gives us the ability to pull them out. As a nice side effect here, like here where the basalt columns are hidden in shadow, if I really focus on these, I can bring these details out. To me, these are some of the best details in this entire image. Especially here, like all of these little details, all of these little basalt columns. I can literally spend hours doing this and tweaking it and just getting it just right. Another nice thing that we can do, and another nice thing you should think about, if I back this up a little bit and I zoom in down here, this can also control eye flow. So the eye tends to follow areas of high contrast and also areas of high lighting first. So it's going to notice these little patterns that you do. Notice the areas that have highlights over shadows. It's a really, really powerful way to just create a 3D look in your image. And it also gives it a little bit more personality. And that's really what we're trying to do here, is give these images personality. Life, emotion, depth, texture, color, and of course, personality. It's also a way, like I said, that you can make them look like they're your own. You can give it your own style and your own look here with this dynamic lighting that we're doing. I really like to chisel out waterfalls. So if I paint black on the waterfall, it's not actually going to make my whites any darker because it's an overlay effect. It's really cool. But what I can do is just start to chisel out the details of these waterfalls here. So where they really fall into themselves. Similar around here, I'm going to do the same thing. But I'm going to do this with a bigger brush because I'm not going to make the whites too much darker, but what I can do is pull these tendrils together here. So this is kind of nice. And again, I could spend hours on this, but this is really where I encourage you guys to explore and start to create your own effects here with the light painting, or with, the dodging and burning and the light enhancement. But you can really start to create your own effects and your own look for the images. So this is nice. Now this is feeling a little bit more selective. It's feeling pretty good. At this point, I may want to assess the overall balance of the image. And what do I mean by balance? Well, right now I was working to capture this really hot sky, so I had to pay attention to not blow out any of these highlights. And even here, they're not blown out, but they are hot. So it's just starting to touch white. If I reset my histogram here, I have nice darks all the way to highlights. This spike over here of red obviously being this part of the sky. But look at the bottom here. No, I want to show you guys, if I actually bring up a window, and I'm going to bring up the info, which is F8 on the keyboard. And I'm actually just going to leave my info palette next to the histogram. With the info palette, if I hit the V key just with the arrow and I start to roll over values, it's going to give me my equivalent RGB. So remember, RGB is really important. It's really important to remember that RGB is called additive color space. 100% red, 100% blue, and 100% green creates white. So any variations of equal portion of all three create shades of gray. So in this case, it's 0 to 255. That's my 8-bit scale. So if I see 255, it's white. If I see 0, it's black. So if I roll over any of these areas, I'm actually seeing, it's not completely grayscale, but I'm seeing like 212. I'm not seeing 255. If I go up here, I'm seeing 150. If I go up here, now I'm starting to see near 240, 250. Up here, I'm seeing 250, 247. I'm getting really close to being blown out. All the way up here, 250. So it's not quite blown out. It's almost there. It's just touching white. The blacks are just touching black. Nothing really hit 0 all the way. Well, this is important because up here, I have great highlights. Down here, I have great shadows. But this whole area here, I feel like I can bring those highlights up. So this is when we start to do things a little bit more selectively. So rather than going back into Nik software, I'm going to do this color correction and light adjustment 100% manually by doing it with adjustment layers. So we're going to create a new adjustment layer called Curves. So remember how I said this curves is really easy to use. It's very powerful, and it will also confuse all your friends and family too and make you look like you're much more of a pro than you actually are because you understand curves. Keep in mind levels are also just as powerful, but they're just sliders, but it does the same thing. So basically levels, if I slide the middle, will be this gamma shift, and then either side will be the clamping of the value. Some people call it crushing whites and blacks. Back in Photoshop 5, we used to call it clamping, but crushing actually sounds cooler, so you should probably say that. In this case, I'm just going to bring all the values up. So I'm going to go ahead and clamp this so I get highlights. And after that, if I take a reading here, I should be able to see that reading reflect. So you see how I have now red is 216/255. That's pre and post correction. So I can actually see what I'm correcting it to. That's way too much, but I wanted to show you guys that I really want that to be closer to white, but I want to leave this guy alone. So I basically created this color correction here, and I'm going to go ahead and hide it, and you can see this is before and after. The thing is I only want it to be associated with the bottom of this, so I'm going to create a gradient on it with the gradient tool, and I'm going to go ahead and fade it so it goes away at the top of the sky so that I don't blow out the sky. So you can see now my sky's intact, and now I get this nice warm. It's not warm, but it's just bringing more light to the foreground. And again, if I want to grab more of it, I can grab the brush tool here and I can paint it in selectively. And I can just add a little bit more sense of highlights. If I feel like I did too much here, I can always paint it out. And now if I look at the curves, you can see that it's adjusted. So basically the curves now reflect not the total image, but they only reflect the area of the image that I have selected. If I clamp this down a little bit more, it'll always reflect what's inside of the mask and underneath. So now I can make changes to my foreground without the background, and I can even make things a little bit brighter all around, and I can also change the contrast just by taking the darks here in the shadows and pulling them down a little bit more. So that's the first adjustment layer. The other thing is I feel like I want more contrast in this entire image, so I'm going to create another adjustment layer. After I build everything with Color Effects Pro, and with the last images we had to take things really far, we had to rely on it to really push the contrast. This scene has all that contrast intact, so I can do some simple things instead with masking, like brightness and contrast. And I can just change the global contrast a little bit here. And I think that looks good, 15. So it's subtle, a little bit of 15 looks pretty good. I can also add a not a hue saturation, I actually want to add a vibrance. Be careful in vibrance though to only change the vibrance. In this case I'm going to take my panel off, going to tear it off so I can look at the sky, because as I start to add vibrance, it's going to pump the blues and greens too much, and you can see that it's adding too much saturation, but just enough to give the highlights and saturation a little bit more kick. Be very wary of changing saturation. Very quickly, it'll look bad. I never change the saturation in this option. I'll always go into the hue and the saturation. I'm going to throw this right back in here for later. And so far, we're doing pretty good. At this point, we've gotten this image. This is where I consider to be about 90–95% done. And believe it or not, the 90 to 95% is the easy part. It's that last 5% of where to take it. So for me, this image is starting to look fairly complete. I love the sky, I love the foreground, I love the soft water, the warmth is really nice, but I might want to add a little bit more color contrast, and I can either do that by painting in more with the dodge and burn. So you guys can see here, if I paint more in with the dodge and burn, I can add more highlights here. and more shadows in certain areas. I can bring some of this out. Or I can go back into Color Effects Pro, or I can use my favorite filter combination or filter package to do things selectively. So maybe on this note of doing things selectively, let's go ahead and do a little bit more. Let's do one Color Effects Pro just so I can show you guys some more fun things that we can do. So I'm going to do Nik Software Color Effects Pro, and just because I want to create sort of an eye flow here. Now, the sky is really intense, but I'm not going to do what we did for the basalt cliffs and Londranger cliffs where I accentuated the sky so much to bring out the detail. Sky's already detailed, so I don't want tonal contrast in the sky, because the first thing I want people to see is this front part of the image here, and you guys can see an eye flow would be the front and this whole waterfall. So I want everybody to sort of look at this image and then notice an epic sky, rather than their eye just popping right to the sky and then the foreground second. So what I'm going to do here is basically just create a little bit of pro contrast, a little bit more, and then I'm going to do a real quick tonal contrast, and I'm going to set this to be, I don't know, fairly intense this time. I want this to be about 10, 12, 12, and maybe 5. So a little before and after here, and then we get more details and more sharpness. And as soon as this applies, there we go. It actually looks pretty cool. The only thing is I don't want those details in the sky. I want to be really careful about not blowing out my values in the sky. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to black out this mask, similar to the way that I painted on my dodging and burning. I'm going to black it out, and I'm actually just going to keep it, sorry about that, I decided to hide it there by accident. Instead of having it in the background here, I really want to focus on the foreground. So I want to paint some of this heavy contrast into the foreground just to chisel out these details, to really chisel out these details. And again, in the basalt here on the left, I really want to chisel out some of these details just so that people start to notice these basalt cliffs a little bit. Remember what I did with the waterfall. I haven't done much painting on the waterfall, but if I start to add that here to the waterfall, you can see that it'll also change some of that and make it a little bit more predominant, pop a little bit of the color, and add a little bit more of the sharpness. So this is pretty cool too. So we have selective sharpening to just cover the basalt cliffs, this foreground, and we have selective tonal contrast just to pop it out even more. At this point, I still think it's a little cool. I'm going to add one more effect, and that's going to be a really simple thing. You guys are going to like this, just a photo filter. A photo filter is going to give me options for warming. There's 3 of them, and I actually like 81, which is the 3rd one, and I'm actually just going to warm the whole thing up just about 12%. So the whole thing is just a little bit warmer. And again, I'm having a problem with the sky. You can see that by doing that, I'm actually changing the sky a little bit. It's starting to blow out the sky, add too much red. So I'm going to do something similar to before. I can actually copy this mask and actually delete this one first. Here's a good way to apply the same mask. I can actually just hold Command, load the mask as a selection. Once the mask is loaded as a selection, after I Command click, I can select my photo filter, create new mask, and I'll mirror that mask. So it'll just be in the foreground, and it'll be really subtle. So we've been able to take this pretty far. We were blending everything together, and it's actually really nice. If we go all the way back, and I like to keep this history, you can see now this one's a little bit more complex. We've added many more layers than we've had in the past, but if we really take a look at this, what we've done for the progression, we've gone from the original exposure, which is still a pretty cool place, and then we've taken it all the way to here. So it's really beautiful, great tones in the sky, awesome detail in the mountains, beautiful soft water, and it all started with this original raw. So you can see, just with a few steps that I've taught you so far in the field and now in post, you can transform your images from ordinary to something a little bit more extraordinary. And not just that it's extraordinary, but now it's something that you've made your own. In this case, great portfolio piece, and it has its own style and flair. I've been developing this style for a while. Hopefully you guys will be able to take these raw files, learn from me, and then use them to practice and develop your own style as well. So that's going to wrap it up for this lesson. And the next lesson, we actually go to the ice caves. And in the ice caves, the editing is going to be a little bit simple, but I'm going to teach you guys a new effect that we haven't talked about yet.